So, picking up from our discussion on embodied cognition and evolutionary paths, we arrive at a fascinating point. We've established that cognition isn't just about having internal representations, it's fundamentally about enacting the world through our bodies. The text highlights three key conditions for this enactive view: modular networks, histories of satisfaction, and developmental qualities. Now, here's the kicker: these three conditions aren't logically tied together. You could have modular systems using directed selection, or rich networks without modularity. But what's really striking is that living organisms empirically satisfy all three. It's not some abstract logical possibility, it's a feature of life itself. General systems or pure logic don't necessarily tick all these boxes. This observation sets the stage for a significant shift in perspective. Now, proposing such a radical shift naturally meets resistance. Think about it. Shaking up deeply ingrained scientific paradigms isn't easy. The text identifies two main flavors of pushback. First, there's the classic holdout, folks sticking to the old ways. They might dismiss these new ideas as minor quibbles, little clouds on the horizon that will eventually blow over with more research. For them, the established view remains largely untouched. Then there's a subtler, more widespread form of resistance. Here, people agree that maybe evolutionary theory needs a rethink, but they only make superficial changes. They tweak the edges but keep the core structure of the old perspective intact. It's like agreeing the house needs painting, but refusing to replace the crumbling foundation. In this case, while the basic acceptance of evolution as drift, point 1a, is pretty standard now, the deeper implications for codetermination, 2a, and development, 3a, are still seen as niche views. The real battleground, the heart of this debate, revolves around how we conceptualize the relationship between an organism and its environment. The authors argue that if you consistently apply the logic of those initial 3 points, you inevitably arrive at a fourth, crucial point, the idea of codetermination. Let's look at the traditional view first. It paints a picture where the environment is this fixed, given backdrop. Organisms are just dropped into this pre-existing world, like paratroopers landing on a prepared field. Darwin introduced change, sure, but even then, the environment was still the source of selective pressures driving evolution. When we shift towards evolution as drift, we take another step back. We start seeing those selective pressures less as rigid external forces and more as broad constraints that need to be satisfied. The critical leap here is away from the notion of an independent pre-given environment and towards emphasizing intrinsic factors, the organism's own dynamics. It's like saying the environment isn't the stage. It's part of the play, co-created by the actors. This brings us to Richard Lewontin's incredibly insightful perspective. He basically says, hold on, the organism and the environment aren't determined separately like two independent variables. He argues forcefully that the environment isn't some external blueprint imposed on life. It's something created by the organisms themselves. It's not an autonomous process running out there. It's a reflection of the biology of the species. Think about it. You can't have an organism without an environment. And according to Lewontin, you can't have an environment without an organism defining it. The key takeaway? The species actively shapes and specifies its own domain of problems, the challenges it faces and adapts to. This domain doesn't exist out there waiting for organisms to land on it like a pre-made runway. Instead, living beings and their environments are locked in a mutual specification, a codetermination. What we call environmental regularities aren't things the organism passively internalizes. They are the outcome of a shared history, a long-term dance between the two. As Lewontin puts it, the organism is both the subject and object of evolution. It's acting upon the world, and the world, shaped by the organism, acts back. Now, why is this codetermination idea so crucial? Because, as Susan Oyama points out, there's a huge temptation when trying to move beyond traditional Darwinism to fall right back into the same old trap. The temptation is to keep the organism and the environment as separate poles, and then just try to figure out the right balance, the proportion of innate versus acquired, natural versus cultivated factors. But this approach, she argues, just resurrects the very problems we thought we were moving past, the tired old debates about nature versus nurture. To truly break free, we need to learn to see organisms and their environments as structures that fold into and unfold relative to each other. Oyama emphasizes this beautifully. Form emerges through successive interaction. It's not something imposed from the outside. It's a function of how matter reacts at various levels, and how these interactions are reciprocally sensitive. Genes and environment aren't opposing forces, they're interdependent, reciprocal aspects of the same process. The natural and the cultivated aren't separate categories, they're product and process in a continuous loop. Let's dig a bit deeper into what this means for genes. How should we think about them in this codetermined framework? The text suggests viewing genes not as blueprints for fixed traits, but as elements that specify what needs to be fixed in the environment for something to operate predictably as a gene. In other words, a gene's function depends on the context it operates within. Every time an organism reproduces, it doesn't just pass on genes, it also transmits the specific environment those genes are embedded in. We often think of things like sunlight or oxygen as external, independent factors, but that's just because our perspective is relative. Look at the interconnectedness of everything, and you see the illusion. This leads to a radical conclusion. There's no meaningful distinction between what's inherited biologically and what's acquired environmentally. Evolution doesn't rely on this split. What's actually needed for evolutionary change isn't some genetically coded thing opposed to acquired traits. Instead, we need operational developmental systems, genomes that are ecologically embedded, constantly interacting and shaping each other. Now, let's be honest, grappling with this perspective can initially feel disorienting. The text calls it vertigo. Why? Because it challenges the very foundations we thought were solid and stable. It's like realizing the ground beneath your feet isn't solid earth but shifting sand. The natural reaction might be to try and ignore this feeling, to sweep it under the rug and just go back to the familiar comfort of separating the internal from the external. But the authors argue against that. Sweeping the vertigo under the rug won't solve anything. Instead, we need to confront this feeling head-on, delve deeper into its philosophical and experiential roots, and fully explore all its implications. It's not about finding a new foundation, but understanding the nature of the groundlessness itself. This exploration is set to continue in the next chapter. Before we wrap up this section, let's briefly touch on some recent theories that try to apply Darwinian selectionist ideas specifically to neural mechanisms. Thinkers like Edelman, Shanja, Cowan, and Piatelli-Palmarini fall into this camp. In terms of the enactive framework discussed, these theories often incorporate the idea of evolution as drift, and sometimes even argue for the codetermination aspects, like the mutual specification of organism and environment. Sometimes they even embrace the full implications, like Gerald Edelman famously stating, "You and the world are jointly embedded." That's quite direct, however, there's often ambiguity. While they talk the talk, it's not always clear how willing these selectionists are to fully ditch the lingering assumptions of an objective, pre-given environment that still seem to surface in their work. It's like acknowledging joint embedding in principle, but still implicitly relying on a background stage in practice. Okay, let's bring it back to perception and cognition. Remember, the core idea is that perception guides action, and cognition is embodied action. The world we know isn't passively received, it's enacted through our history of structural coupling. Now, someone might object. But wait, perception and cognition clearly involve optimal adaptations to the world, right? Like our eyes being perfectly tuned to light? This is where the evolutionary detour becomes crucial. Let's revisit color vision. We know there are different color spaces. Some animals see in 2 dimensions, others in 3, 4, even 5. Each of these unique ways of perceiving color emerges or is enacted through a specific history of structural coupling. So, how do we explain these different color spaces? The authors argue against explaining them as optimal adaptations to different physical regularities of the world. Instead, they propose these arise from different histories of natural drift. And crucially, since organisms and environments co-determine each other, the environmental regularities associated with these color spaces, like surface reflectances, must be specified alongside the animal's perceptual activity. It's a joint creation. Consider bees and flowers. Bees have trichromatic vision, including sensitivity to ultraviolet light. Now, remember that classic chicken and egg question. Did the UV reflecting world come first, or did the UV sensitive bee vision? Most people would probably guess the world, the physical properties of flowers reflecting UV light. But here's the twist. Studies suggest flower colors have co-evolved with bee vision. Why? Flowers need to stand out to attract pollinators like bees, but bees need to spot those flowers from a distance to find food. These two broad reciprocal needs seem to have shaped a coupling history where plant traits and bee sensorimotor skills evolved together. This co-evolution is responsible for the bee's UV vision and the specific UV patterns on flowers. This is a fantastic example of how environmental regularities aren't pre-given, they emerge through the history of coupling. As Lewontin says, our nervous system hasn't adapted to absolute laws of nature, but to laws operating within a framework created by our own sensory activity. Bees see what we don't, and bats see what owls don't, because their sensory frameworks are different, shaped by their evolutionary paths. Now, it's important to distinguish this emphasis on codetermination from another influential perspective: J. Gibson's ecological approach to perception. Don't confuse them. Gibson's view, while rejecting internal representations, still largely sees the world as pre-given. His idea was that organisms with different perceptions simply have different perspectives on this same underlying reality. Think of it like having different camera lenses on the same scene. Our view, however, stresses something much more radical. The organism and the environment are mutually folded, intertwined. The world experienced by any particular organism emerges or is enacted through its unique history of structural coupling. And remember, these coupling histories aren't driven by optimal adaptation, but by evolution as drift. Gibson's approach has two main pillars. First, affordances, the opportunities for interaction that objects offer based on an animal's abilities, like a tree offering the possibility of climbing. These are seen as distinctively ecological properties. Second, his famous direct perception hypothesis, the idea that light itself contains enough information to specify the environment directly, without needing internal representations. Optical invariants in the light supposedly tell us about the world out there. This second point from Gibson, direct perception via optical invariants, is where the paths diverge significantly from the inactive view. It's easy to overlook this difference because both reject representationalism and talk about action-guided perception. But for Gibson, action-guided perception is essentially about selecting or attending to these pre-existing optical invariants that directly specify their source. For him, these invariants and the properties they represent are independent of the animal's activity. Gibson famously stated, "The invariance comes from reality, not the other way around." He believed these optical patterns are there to be discovered. Notice the emphasis on the invariance being out there, discoverable. In contrast, the inactive view holds that the environment is enacted, and perception is an active, sensorimotor in action. This leads to very different research strategies. Gibson focused heavily on optics and ecology, trying to build perception theory purely from the environment side. The inactive approach focuses on specifying the sensorimotor models that allow action to be guided by perception, building perception theory from the animal's structural coupling with the world. So, let's try to pin down the inactive approach. Placing cognition as embodied action within the context of evolution as drift gives us a powerful lens. Cognitive skills become seen as inextricably linked to lived histories, paths that exist only because they are continually walked, as Machado beautifully put it. Cognition, then, isn't about solving problems based on internal representations. In its broadest sense, cognition is the enactment of a world, making a world emerge through a viable history of structural coupling. Notice the emphasis on viable, not necessarily optimal. This is a huge difference. If coupling had to be optimal, the system's interactions would be highly prescribed. But viability just requires the system's actions to facilitate its own continued existence ontogeny and/or the continuation of its lineage phylogeny. It's a proscriptive logic. Do whatever works as long as it doesn't break the system or kill the line. There's no need for a perfect plan. Just keep the engine running. This view also offers a fresh take on intentionality. Embodied cognition, always oriented towards action, is always directed towards something absent. There's always a next step, a future possibility driving the current action. The system is perpetually reaching toward situations that haven't yet occurred. So the intentionality of embodied cognition, the authors suggest, primarily lies in this directedness of action. This connects to the classic philosophical understanding of intentionality having two aspects: how the system interprets the world and how the world satisfies or fails to satisfy that interpretation. Here, the first aspect corresponds to the possibilities for action the system perceives, and the second corresponds to how the resulting situations meet or fail to meet those possibilities. What does this mean for cognitive science? It means shifting focus. We need to study how the environment constrains the system, and how the system's sensorimotor structure specifies those constraints. We need to explain how sensorimotor and environmental regularities emerge from this coupling. The goal is to investigate the mechanisms of coupling deployment and how specific patterns of regularity arise. All right, let's formulate the inactive approach in precise terms, answering the kinds of questions asked of earlier cognitive science programs. Question 1. What is cognition? Answer. Enaction, a history of bodily coupling that enacts or brings forth a world. Question 2. How does it work? Answer. Through a network consisting of multiple interconnected levels of sensory-motor subnetworks. Question 3. How do we know if a cognitive system is working properly? Answer. When it successfully integrates into a pre-existing world of significance, like offspring of a species, or when it configures a new one, as happens in evolutionary history. What's revolutionary here? Representation is no longer central. The role of the environment as a mere information source diminishes. It only becomes relevant when the system hits a snag, a collapse it can't handle. Intelligence, therefore, transforms. It's no longer just about problem-solving ability. It's about the capacity to enter a shared world of significance. Now, the pragmatic engineer or AI researcher might raise an eyebrow and say, all this talk about inaction versus representation is fine, but what's the real-world impact? Does this actually change anything in robotics or AI? The authors take this very seriously. They argue that without the core concepts of the inactive approach, cognitive science cannot adequately account for living cognition, nor can it build truly intelligent artifacts. Inactivism isn't just philosophy, it's essential for practical progress. This means shifting away from task-oriented design towards processes more akin to evolution as drift. Simulating long histories of coupling using various evolutionary strategies can help uncover trends in cognitive performance. A prime example is Rodney Brooks' work on intelligence without representation. His approach? Build simple, complete, autonomous systems and test them in the real world, gradually adding complexity. His key finding was that for basic intelligence, explicit representations are actually a hindrance. It's often better to use the world as the model. His hypothesis? Representation is a flawed abstraction when building the core parts of intelligent systems. He critiques the traditional AI tendency towards abstraction, separating perception and motion, arguing it misses the essence of intelligence, which resides in its embodiment. Brooks's strategy involves building fully autonomous mobile agents that humans perceive as intelligent. His key innovation isn't decomposing the system by function like perception module, central processor, action module, but by activity. He breaks it down into subsystems that produce specific activities, each connecting sensory input directly to action output. Each layer decides when to act on its own. Think of his creature robot. It avoids obstacles, stops if something blocks its path. Simple, complete, tested in the real world. Importantly, there's no single place where perception communicates a traditional representation. There might even be multiple parallel channels connecting sensors to actions. Crucially, there's no central system dictating everything. Layers act autonomously, and coherence or purpose emerges from their interactions. As Brooks says, delocalized chaos of their interactions emerges, to the eyes of the observer, a coherent model of behavior. By layering these activities, he aims to create increasingly sophisticated autonomous behavior, hoping eventually to reach insect-level intelligence. This contrasts sharply with the classic AI approach where robots are given specific goals, tasks, or plans. Brooks explicitly states his approach isn't connectionism, production rules, or hermeneutics. It's driven by the same desire for technical efficacy that fueled cognitivism and connectionism. This shows that the inactive view of cognition isn't just a philosophical preference. It's emerging from the logic of research and development itself, even among engineers focused on building useful machines. This also touches on the relationship between emergentism and inactivism. How we interpret distributed networks matters. If we emphasize that historical processes lead to emergent regularities without fixed endpoints, we get the most open biological condition, aligning with inactivism. But if we focus on a network acquiring a very specific, well-defined ability like net talk, then representations tend to creep back in, which is the typical use of connectionist models. Take Paul Smolensky's harmony theory. It's generally compatible with inactivism, but he evaluates his models against a non-violated level of external reality. The goal is to find an internal network state that optimally encodes the external environment. Inactivism, however, would push back against this notion of optimal encoding. Instead, it demands avoiding all forms of optimality and focusing on viable coupling sustained over a prolonged history. There's a trade-off. Staying closer to biological reality might mean sacrificing immediate technical applications, But defining a fixed domain for connectionism risks obscuring the deep issues of biological embodiment that are central to inactivism. To conclude this section, this inactive program, once perhaps seen as heterodox, is increasingly woven into the fabric of research across diverse fields: psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, AI, evolutionary theory, even immunology. Even the most pragmatic areas like robotics are feeling its influence. The debate is definitely heating up, with many nuanced positions emerging. The key takeaway is that inactivism is no longer just a fringe idea, it's a vital, varied, and growing research program. It offers a way out of the traditional subject-object split. We've traced how cognition as embodied action, linked to lived histories, through evolution as drift, leads to this view. Our human embodiment and the world we enact are just one possible evolutionary path. We are always constrained by the path we've taken, but there's no ultimate foundation dictating the steps we take. This leads us to the final philosophical challenge: grappling with this lack of foundation, this uncertainty inherent in the path we tread. That's the topic for the next part.